Think Roman slavery was brutal? Ancient Egypt wasn't far behind, but here's something you probably didn't expect. There were actually things even the pharaohs could not do to their slaves. So, what were the limits? What couldn't a pharaoh, or anyone else, legally or culturally do to a slave? And why did these restrictions exist in the first place? The many faces of slavery. To understand what pharaohs couldn't do, we first need to understand who their slaves were. Slavery in ancient Egypt wasn't monolithic. There were different categories, different origins, and different expectations. Some slaves were war captives, foreigners dragged from places like Canaan, Nubia, or Libya, and forced into labor. These slaves were considered property in the truest sense. They could be beaten, sold, and bred like livestock. But others were native Egyptians, people who had fallen into debt, children sold by their parents, or criminals sentenced to forced labor. These individuals weren't quite chattel, and their treatment could vary wildly. Sometimes they were treated as little more than animals. Other times, they lived in households, educated the children, or even held responsible administrative roles. And here's the first surprise. Not all Egyptian slaves were poor. Some had property, some married, a few even owned slaves of their own. Still, whatever their status, the one thing they all shared was this: their freedom and their bodies belonged to someone else. Divine authority, human limits. Pharaohs were considered living gods. Their word was law. So you might think they could do anything they wanted to their slaves, especially if those slaves were war captives or criminals. But even the pharaoh's divine authority had boundaries. Ancient Egyptian society was deeply ritualistic and driven by the concept of ma'at, order, balance, justice. While this didn't mean justice in any modern sense, it did impose moral obligations on rulers. A pharaoh who ruled unjustly threatened cosmic balance and risked divine punishment. This was more than superstition. It was politics, religion, and law fused together. So when it came to how pharaohs and elites treated their slaves, there were religious and ideological constraints. Excessive cruelty, especially public cruelty, could be seen as a violation of ma'at. And that meant limits, even if they were rarely enforced. Beating and killing slaves. Let's get specific. Could pharaohs kill their slaves at will? In theory, yes. But in practice, it was complicated. There are no surviving Egyptian laws that explicitly prohibited the killing of a slave. But there are indirect clues. Some temple records and administrative texts refer to punishments for the unjust killing of servants, especially when it endangered temple property or disrupted religious work. The key word here is unjust. A master could beat or even execute a slave, but only if the offense warranted it. Random or sadistic violence risked offending the gods, especially if the slave worked in a temple or was dedicated to divine service. Killing a temple slave, for example, could be seen as desecration. Moreover, the state had an interest in preserving its labor force. In large construction projects, workers, even enslaved ones, were issued rations, beer, and medical treatment. Not because they were valued as humans, but because dead workers meant delays. And delays meant angering the gods and undermining royal propaganda. So no, a pharaoh couldn't just walk onto a worksite and slaughter laborers for amusement. Not without consequences, divine or practical. Sacred boundaries and forbidden desires. One of the darkest realities of slavery in most ancient societies was the sexual vulnerability of enslaved women. In Egypt, this was no different. But again, there were limits. Temples were considered sacred zones, and the people who worked within them, priests, scribes, and even some slaves, were expected to live by strict codes of purity. Sexual relations with a temple slave, especially by someone of royal or priestly status, could be seen as a violation of ritual purity. In some cases, the gods themselves were believed to take offense. Offending a deity wasn't just bad manners, it was cosmic sabotage. There are inscriptions warning priests and officials against abusing temple workers, and these were enforced more seriously than you might expect. Outside temple life, though, the story was grimmer. There were few protections for enslaved women. They could be forced into concubinage, sexual labor, or even prostitution. Unless protected by a patron, household status, or rare contractual clauses. So while pharaohs had terrifying power, even they had to tread carefully when it came to sacred boundaries. Selling and trading human lives. You might assume that pharaohs could buy and sell slaves however they wanted, and for the most part, they could, but not always. In some legal texts, especially those from the New Kingdom onward, there are contracts that place restrictions on slave sales. For example, some contracts forbid the resale of certain slaves to foreign lands or to disreputable owners. In some cases, these clauses were motivated by practical concerns, like ensuring the slave remained near their family or continued to perform a religious duty. And then there were temple slaves, who couldn't be sold at all. They were considered property of the gods. That meant even a pharaoh couldn't legally sell a temple slave. Doing so would be stealing from the divine, and no ruler, not even Ramses the Great, wanted that stain on their soul. Slaves and the right to freedom. Could a pharaoh free a slave? Absolutely. Could they stop someone else from doing so? Sometimes. Manumission, the freeing of a slave, was rare but not unheard of in ancient Egypt. It wasn't codified in the same way as in Rome, where laws like the Lex Fufia Canina regulated how many slaves could be freed. But records do survive of slaves being granted freedom for loyal service, religious devotion, or as part of a last will. Interestingly, once freed, a person often retained close ties to their former master's household. Sometimes they even continued to serve voluntarily. And if the slave had been granted land or tools, they might rise to a modest level of independence. But here's the catch. Not every pharaoh could revoke someone else's manumission. If a former owner had granted freedom under religious auspices, dedicating the act to a god, then even the pharaoh's word could be contested. Divine authority trumped royal authority in specific contexts. That's how deeply religion ran in Egyptian law. Protecting the pharaoh's image. Egyptian pharaohs weren't just rulers, they were living symbols. Their actions were constantly observed by scribes, officials, and priests. Every decree, every punishment, every death ordered by the crown was recorded, archived, and, if it suited the regime, carved in stone for eternity. That meant pharaohs had to maintain an image. They could be harsh, but not irrational. Cruel, but not barbaric. Excessive violence, particularly against slaves who were perceived as loyal, could damage that image. We see this in artwork and inscriptions. Pharaohs are often depicted smiting enemies, foreigners, rebels, traitors. But almost never do we see them attacking slaves. That absence is telling. The pharaoh was supposed to be a bringer of order, not a generator of chaos. Even his brutality had to be justifiable. So while he had near absolute power, he couldn't afford to look like a tyrant, especially when the audience was the gods themselves. Cultural expectations and community pressure. Now let's get one thing straight. Most slaves in ancient Egypt had no rights. They were bought, sold, worked to exhaustion, and frequently abused. But there were social pressures that limited how far their masters could go. If a master tortured or starved a slave so severely that it disrupted the household or made the gods angry, neighbors took notice. And in a small community, reputation mattered. A man who mistreated his household too viciously could lose status, be ostracized, or even find himself the subject of complaints to local officials. Was this justice? Not really. But it was a kind of informal regulation, one born not from mercy, but from social survival. Contracts, clauses, and legal gray zones. In some cases, Egyptians wrote clauses into slave contracts that limited what a master could do. Some contracts, especially those involving skilled slaves, stipulated that the slave couldn't be transferred to another region or had to be freed after a set number of years. These were rare, but they existed, and once written, they had legal power. One known clause prohibited the forced prostitution of female slaves. Another forbade the castration of male slaves, a practice that, while less common in Egypt than elsewhere, was still known. Violating these clauses could lead to fines, loss of status, or even the freeing of the slave involved. So yes, pharaohs could order lives changed with a word. But even they had to tiptoe around contracts protected by temple law or divine edict. Pharaohs were powerful, but not invincible, and even in a brutal world like ancient Egypt, there were slivers of resistance. Not from slaves themselves, but from law, religion, and the delicate machinery of royal power. Because in a kingdom ruled by gods, even the God King had rules.